Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning to anyone who is other than in the UK, and welcome to the Dive In Festival and this webinar, Don't Be on Mute, Speaking Up to Safeguard Others. There have been many great events over the past 3 days as part of this festival, and we've looked at a very wide range of subjects and challenges. And this webinar is going to be looking in particular at the challenge for all of us in connection with gender-based violence. In the UK, the death of Sarah Everard was a shocking event and sadly is not an isolated incident. Just last Friday, a young teacher, Sabina Nessa, was killed in a park in East London. From #MeToo to Everyone's Invited, we have seen the depth and extent of violence and harassment, physical and emotional, and via social media. We have recently seen MPs feeling unable to attend the Labour Party conference because of the threats of violence that have been made to them and concerns for their safety. So today, as part of the theme of Dive In, we are going to be looking at what we can all do as allies for those who may be suffering from and feel unable to or are able to disclose the violence that they are suffering. Today we have a panel of 3 and we have 2 films from 2 speakers who were unable to join us in person. And we're going to look at those films first of all before we move on to consider the topics for today and to answer any questions. Please do submit any questions in the usual format and we will endeavour to get to them. But as you can imagine, we have an awful lot to cover today. And if we can't answer questions today, we will answer them thereafter. So our first film is from Jess Phillips MP, Shadow Minister for Domestic Violence and Safeguarding. Jess has previously said it's so important for everyone to make domestic abuse their business. We all need to get comfortable with asking questions. Ask your friends, family and colleagues, is everything okay at home? Educate yourself about what a healthy relationship is and should look and sound like. But let's hear from her herself.
If you work with people, then you will be working with people who suffer violence and abuse. It's really important that everybody makes it their business to care about domestic abuse, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. This is a way that we can all act as allies to those who may be suffering in silence. It's really important that our staff and our customers can bring their whole selves wherever they are, whether that's in public, at work, or at home. And so it's really important that businesses make sure that they have proper policies around domestic abuse, proper assistance, people who their staff and customers can talk to if they need help. I would highly recommend that any business signs up to the AIDA scheme, which is the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse. They will help you create policies, look at how you can support your members of staff and how you can act together to try and end violence and abuse, especially against women and girls. It isn't enough just to say that you care. An ally is somebody who does something active to make sure that they are helping those who maybe can't always help themselves. In workplaces, I have seen cases where people were allowed to use the fear of their bosses finding out about their experiences at home to continue to abuse them. I'm afraid I've worked on cases where women were murdered in their place of work while nobody at work knew what was happening to them. It's really, really important that we all take a stand and do something to make sure that the people we work with and the people we work for are safe and well and can take an active part in society. Being an ally in this area will make you a better employer, it will make you a better business, it will provide a better service. And also, it's just the right thing to do. I welcome this conference and all of the discussions around diversity and inclusion. But what we must always make sure of is that we don't just check the boxes, that our inclusion actually means that everybody can feel included, can feel happy and healthy wherever they are, whatever they are doing. Because organisations that deal with risk should be able to understand that risk is dynamic, and in some people's lives, risks mean that they are not able to properly function. It's really, really important that our workforces and our workplaces represent the society that we live in and the customer base that we hope to have. And that is why diversity and inclusion shouldn't just be a tick box. It should be an absolute fundamental part of what we do in our workplaces and in our businesses. I hope that the conference goes well, and I thank you all for considering doing just maybe that extra bit more. Ask yourself, what is it that you can do that would make it better? Is there someone at your workplace whose people could talk to? Is it safe? Is it right? And is everybody happy and healthy?
Well, thank you, Jess. We're very grateful for your contribution and understand why you can't be here today. Now, Jess referred to IDA, the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, and we'll be hearing from Steve Moore, their acting CEO, in our panel discussion. Jess also asked us all to think of what we can all do to address the issue of gender violence, and that's what we're going to talk about today in our panel discussion. But before we consider how we can answer that question, we're very grateful to Fiona Bowman for sharing with us her experiences of domestic abuse and for the strength that she found with the support of her employer to escape from her life of abuse. Now, sadly, Fiona can't be with us in person today, but again, she has provided us with a film which I ask you all to listen to carefully. So she describes her experience of abuse.
My name is Fiona Bowman, and I was born and brought up in a little place on the east coast of Scotland called Dyser. In my childhood and teenage years, I had a number of adverse experiences, including having an abusive mother. All I wanted to do when I was 16 was to leave home, move away, and find a job to support myself. I applied to Queen Margaret College to do a nursing course and went off to Edinburgh to start my training. It was there, in the first few weeks of my course, that I met Derek Muir. I was naive and vulnerable, with low self-esteem. He seemed funny and different and came from a world that I'd never inhabited. Our relationship started with flowers and chocolates and poems and very early declarations of love. He isolated me from my friends and family and systematically took over my life. He didn't like me nursing male patients or working with male colleagues. So after a year and a half of the course, he convinced me that nursing wasn't for me. And I left the course and got a job in Bristol Bank. I moved around various branches in Scotland and often trying to conceal injuries before I went to work at their international branch in Edinburgh. Eventually, I got a job at Standard Chartered Bank in Edinburgh, and throughout the 11 years of our relationship, violence and the abuse escalated. Having my job was so important. Work was the place I could be me. Home was where I was violated and abused, and work was my oasis. I wasn't stupid. The work that I did was sometimes quite complex. But as the day went on, I would become more nervous about going home. And if he rang me during the day and started shouting at me on the phone, calling me horrible names, I would try to pretend to my work colleagues that everything was fine. I'm sure people could hear and see. No one said anything. No one wants to interfere. He constantly accused me of having affairs with my colleagues, and I Couldn't go to nights out or social events because I wouldn't know what sort of mood he'd be in when I got home. And when he hurt me and hit me, I often had bruises. I had finger marks on my neck where he tried to strangle me, and I would have to wear polo necks and long sleeves, even in summer. Sometimes, when he kicked and battered me, my ribs hurt so much I could hardly walk, and I'd fall in sick. My manager told me that I was going to get another warning about my poor attendance record, and he was also going to have to discipline me for being overdrawn without authority. How can you tell your colleagues when awful things? He kicked and hurt my old English sheepdog Heidi and wouldn't let me take her to a vet. I sat up all night with her, and in the morning, exhausted and sad, to go and do a day's work. And one day at work, an ambulance was called for me because I was having a miscarriage. I couldn't tell my colleagues or my boss that he'd kicked and punched my stomach the night before when I told him I was pregnant. Still went back to him, but he said if he couldn't have me, no one else could. And if I left, he would come and find me and kill me. And I believed him. So there was no escape. My only escape was work. He had a serrated diver's knife in the drawer by the bed, and I was terrified that he would use it on me. He had a fascination with guns, and there was one in the cabinet. Just the threat of weapons is enough to keep you afraid. You can't tell anyone. It's like living in a twilight world. There are so many forms of abuse that you can't tell people about. Often, you'll be at work, but your head is back to what happened last night. Presenteeism, they call it. Being there, but not being there in your mind. Financial abuse is another element. I was at one point working 3 jobs. I just couldn't keep things going. I couldn't tell my boss why we were in such dire financial straits. We had rent arrears, credit card debt, expensive high-interest loans, and all the time I was too ashamed to tell anyone about the financial chaos. They say that 74% of victims stay longer because of debt. So, after the last worst beating, I ended up in Edinburgh Royal Infirmary Head Injuries Unit. When the nurses were going through my things, they found the keys to the bank vaults, and they insisted that they ring my manager and get him to come and get them. I didn't want him to see me. I was ashamed, but he came in, and that was the start of a part of my story where my employers helped me escape. They helped to change my life. So what did they do? Well, one of the most important things they did was to believe me. They were non-judgmental. Someone from HR came, and I will always remember what she said. You won't be listening to me right now, but when you're ready, give me a call and we'll help you escape. Left me her business card. It took me quite a few weeks to pack up the courage to reach out for her. They gave me time off to sort things out. They let me go to see the bank solicitor so that I could start divorce proceedings. I had time off to go and see my landlord and get my name taken off the tenancy. They let me go a few minutes early to go and sort out my finances. I managed to borrow some money to pay off the debts and tried to leave my credit score intact. They transferred me to a branch 400 miles away in London. They covered my tracks and told everyone that I had left, including my ex-husband, when he came and waited outside the bank after I'd left, questioning everyone, approaching my parents, demanding that they tell him where I was. And using my job as a vehicle that carried me away from my abuser, I left my home and my surroundings. I had to leave my old English sheepdog Heidi, one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. I travelled from Edinburgh to London and started a new life with a hold on what I stood up in and a job to go to on the Monday in Standard Chartered Bank, King William Street in the city of London. I didn't know where I was going to sleep that night, but I managed to find a hotel, which was actually a DSS hostel. I checked in and locked the door in my little room, knowing that whatever lay ahead of me, I would never go back to the horror of the abusive relationship I had left. Over time, I changed from banking to a career in facilities management, and I started to climb the ladder of success, not looking back, and not telling anyone about the fact that I'd been a victim of domestic abuse. I worked for some of the biggest organisations. Goldman Sachs, I was a property manager for their London headquarters, Moscow, Paris, and Zurich offices. I was a facilities manager for HSBC. I helped Bank of America move to their new building at 5 Canada Square. And eventually, I became head of facilities at Lloyd's Register in Fenchurch Street. But it wasn't until I was general manager of Lloyd's of London in that famous Richard Rogers building in the city, managing 170 support staff, that I felt comfortable telling my story. I didn't want to be perceived as weak and not able to take on senior management positions. Many victims in senior roles don't disclose for exactly that reason. We have to change that narrative. And so it was in 2004 that I wrote my book, having written some of the stories in notebooks over the years as a catharsis. I rang Refuge and asked them if they knew a publisher who would help me publish. They rang back a couple of days later, not with a publisher, but with a request from Jenny Murray on Radio 4 Women's Hour, who wanted to interview me. So the first time I told my story was on national radio. I don't believe in doing anything by halves. And since then, I've been invited to speak in some amazing places. I've been on the BBC Breakfast Red Sofa. I've spoken at some very high-profile conferences, Mansion House, number 10 Downing Street, Guildhall, Hillsborough Castle, Belfast, and trained over 1,000 Surrey police officers. And today, talking to all of you on this excellent dive-in webinar. Having missed out on college because of being in my abusive relationship, it was with some excitement that I embarked on an MBA course, part-time in the evenings, and to my absolute delight, in the year 2000, I graduated, proving to myself that I wasn't stupid. I'm a chartered member of the Institute of Workplace and Facilities Management, and I've become a fellow of the Chartered Management Institute. People don't quite get why I put all of these letters after my name at the slightest opportunity. They don't know how amazing it is for someone who was beaten within an inch of her life to be taken seriously in business and to have achieved qualifications. In 2015, I became a member of a city livery company, the worshipful company of security professionals. I became a freeman of the City of London, and later that year, one of the rights as a freeman is that I herded some sheep over London Bridge. More recently, I've become an ambassador for IDA, the Employers' Initiative on Domestic Abuse, and I'm also an ambassador for Alpha Vesta CIC, leading their Survivors Symposium. I'm delighted, too, to have recently become a board member of Oasis Community Housing, a homelessness charity in Newcastle. And my book, Did I Wake You Pet? Well, available on Amazon and from the publishers, Austin Macaulay. When I launched the book in 2017, I managed to track down Graham Whitaker, the manager of Standard Chartered Bank in Edinburgh, who helped me all those years ago. I was proud to tell him about all of the amazing things that have happened and helped me escape. I don't think that he did very much, but I know what he did. I call this presentation From the Cupboard to the City, because on a Friday night, I used to hide in the airing cupboard to avoid a beating from my husband when he came in from the pub. I have achieved success in my career and have managed some of the most iconic buildings in the City of London and beyond. To have come from the horror of abuse to where I am now is pretty amazing. Every day I wake up and I'm glad to be alive. And the reason I speak out and campaign, you might have a Fiona in your workplace, turning up every day, desperately trying to be taken seriously by colleagues, wanting to be respected and normal. And if your workplaces can put policies and structures in place where victims can be given the time and the support they need and be signposted to the professional help out there, you might just save a life. I speak on behalf of all of the people who right now are suffering in silence, too terrified to seek help. My mantra is, be the change you want to see in the world. Let it be yours. Thank you.
So although Fiona is not able to join us in person today, I want to thank her for sharing her story. I'm sure her words will remain with all of us long after this webinar has ended. Fiona talked of the colleague who believed her and believed in her and supported her in a non-judgmental way. They are just two practical things that we can all do, but there are many more. And to consider how we can all be allies, I'm very pleased to welcome our panellists for today's discussion. I will ask them first of all to briefly introduce themselves, starting with Harriet.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I am a lawyer and the director and founder of the Centre for Women's Justice. The Centre for Women's Justice is a legal charity which aims to hold the state accountable around violence against women and girls and challenge discrimination in the criminal justice system. So we are primarily a criminal justice organisation, but we work very much with all the frontline organisations like Refuge that was mentioned just now and many others that support women directly. And we assist them in advocating more effectively for women who are victims not just of domestic abuse, sexual violence, and many other forms of violence against women, which are always important to remember. So, and we do strategic litigation as well. And I've worked with a whole range of different people. Fiona's story reminded me quite a lot of Sally Challen, who's a client I work with, who appealed her murder conviction. That was quite a high-profile case, raising the issue of coercive control. And we know that many women who are victims of coercive control and violence, sometimes sadly end up dead. And sometimes they end up taking the life of their abuser. I won't say any more for now, but I can come back with a little bit more later.
Thank you, Harriet. Steve, if you could introduce yourself, please.
Yes, delighted to do so, and thank you very much for, again, having me along. What a powerful presentation that was from Fiona. I'm the acting CEO of the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, or IDA, as it's been referred to. Our core purpose is to enable employers to take action on domestic abuse, to raise awareness, and to support everybody who may be affected within their employee population, to make sure that employers have policies in place, that they understand what training is needed within their organisation to facilitate support. Our vision as an organisation is to have every employer taking action on domestic abuse. And the mission really is to bring together all the experience, the expertise, and the best practice of employers and various partners, so that ultimately all employers across the UK can support any of their employees affected by domestic abuse. Membership is free of IDA, so there's no barriers to any employer joining. And not only do we have our members, we represent about 950 employers across the UK, who will employ roughly 8 million people. That's possibly around 25% of the working population of the UK. So we have a huge number of employers in different sectors doing great stuff in this area. And as well as that, we have our ambassador network, you heard from Fiona, where we have a whole host of people who have connections with the issue and are able to spread the word and to encourage others to take up the cudgels and make sure that every potential victim and indeed perpetrator can be supported to end this ridiculous pandemic of abuse that we do have across the whole of the country at the moment.
And finally, Kate.
Thank you very much, Paula, and thank you for having me here today. And Steve, as you said, that was a really, really powerful video. Certainly one that will stay with me beyond this event. And my name is Kate Connolly. I'm a compliance officer at Liberty Specialty Markets based in our London office. And I'm also the chair of our Gender Matters DE&I network. That's one of 7 Inclusion Matters networks at the company. A bit about Liberty. Liberty is very much a values-driven organisation committed to DE&I and to responsible business. Liberty believes that recognising, appreciating and applying the unique perspectives of each person is the cornerstone of a high-performing company. Our Inclusion Matters framework supports our commitment to strengthen our diverse workforce and grow our inclusive environment. Inclusion is at the heart of how we do business and live our values every day. And lastly, in fact, our parent company, Liberty Mutual, is one of the sponsors of this event. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their contribution.
Thank you all. So, Harriet, if I can come to you first, and really to just give us an indication from your perspective of the extent of the problem that we face as a society at the moment with regards to violence against women, and to the extent to which you think that has been impacted by COVID and working from home.
Well, violence against women has been described and is being described today as a pandemic. It is in fact, a public health emergency on a par with COVID. It kills many women each year, and we saw with the Sarah Everard case, and sadly this latest terrible story of Sabrina Nessa, I think her name was, sorry, who was murdered, whose body was found just a couple of days ago. And the deaths are really the sort of final toll of what is something that happens at every stage and at every level. And we also know, in terms of criminal justice issues, that we have a failing criminal justice system. We have very few cases of violence against women actually effectively investigated, and even fewer prosecuted. And so we see basically, sadly, many perpetrators still able to continue, and some of the people who are responsible for these terrible murders are men who have repeatedly got away with violence and abuse from lower level crimes right through to these terrible murders that we've heard about. So it is a problem of a major scale, and in fact on Friday, the same day that Sabrina went missing, a report was published by the inspectorate, which looked at the issue in relation to policing and the lack of effective protections that women received from the police, and also named the problem of violence against women as a pandemic, and as one that should receive the same level of resourcing as we've seen put into the terrorist threat, for example. And so this is a problem that has been with us, certainly over the last 30 years since I've been practicing as a lawyer, and it's been with us forever, sadly. And it's something that needs addressing. We need turning everything around, and we need to think about it really as it is possible to turn things around. Public health crises. We've seen the amount of resources that have gone into COVID, for example, and the vaccination program, as if there is a will and a commitment. We've seen campaigns around smoking at work, smoking in public, which have really, really changed behaviour. And we have seen campaigns around drink driving as well. So that there is the potential to change things, but it requires a will. And I think one of the most powerful things that Fiona said in her speech was how important it is to be believed, and also how difficult it was for her to disclose what she was going through. And certainly in a work context, we need to think about those things. I haven't really answered your question about COVID, but we know that numbers, or the reports of domestic violence have gone up very significantly during the lock-ins, and the pressures there are no doubt, and people being stuck at home are no doubt part of the cause. But we have this pandemic of violence against women, which exists in any event around, and has done, regardless of COVID and the interaction of that.
Thank you. And Steve, coming to you, in terms of the work that IDA is doing, obviously you are the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, and whilst we know that there is a significant amount of violence directed towards women, domestic abuse isn't just men towards women, is it? In your role, how much is there of, that is irrespective of gender or sexual orientation in that sphere?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to make. I mean, I don't think there's any doubt that Harriet touched on the horrendous end results of a series of domestic abuse incidents and where they end up leading to. And I think there's no question that women, without are the worst sufferers when it comes to the end result in terms of numbers. But if we look at the stats across the UK, 1 in 4 women will experience some form of domestic abuse in any number of categories that might exist in. But 1 in 6 men will also come into touch with it or experience it. So I think added to that, it's not so much that it's a gender issue. You've then got all the attendant families, the children, and everybody surrounded within that support network who's affected by it. So it is a problem for everybody. Everybody can be a victim of it, to a certain extent of it. And I think from our point of view, it's just been around making sure that it's not solely focused on the agenda for women, but a recognition has to be, there has to be recognition rather that, women are predominantly suffering, I think, more than most. But equally, we've got the LGBT plus community, we've got the community in the various different formats and difficulties and disabilities. There are also huge numbers of people in those demographics who are also suffering. So yeah, to your point, it's definitely not just about one gender. We have to, when we're thinking from an employer's point of view, it's about supporting all the employees rather. It's about supporting all the different people within your organisation and all their diversity. They are all likely, I guess, similarly likely to come into contact with it and therefore need support.
Thank you. And can I just, Steve, again, just a question for you around the Domestic Abuse Act, and that's going through various stages of implementation. Before we sort of come on with Kate to the things that employers can do, can you just sort of give us a very brief overview on where that has reached and what impact it will have?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the passing of the bill is a seminal moment for, I think, the sector and the subject matter. I mean, it's I guess the pandemic as well, but we're definitely in a moment. We started the Employers Initiative 5 years ago. We are clearly in a moment now where the public psyche is now coming to terms with the fact that this is something that needs to be tackled. And echoing what Harriet said, change can take place. Part of that change is definitely legislation, and what the Act has done it's identified that there's a specific category and formal definition of abuse that can constitute a crime it's also, I guess, identified within that it's not just about physical violence. You've got emotional, coercive, and controlling behaviour. You've got economic abuse. Fiona touched on that. One of the most significant factors in people trying to break out of a relationship is the worry in terms of the impact on finance. I think for employers, it means get yourself up to speed with the various elements of how that affects individuals. There's also an extension to post-separation. So when people are no longer in a relationship, it can be recognised that it's still part. The Act is covering the fact that there's still a crime potentially to be committed there. It's established the office of the Domestic Abuse Commissioner for England and Wales. So we've now got a figurehead in the public domain who can be a focal point for, raising these issues. There are elements in it around the disclosure of intimate images. That's a huge issue with the explosion of social media in the last 4 or 5 years. There are now specific legislative elements of it that will deal with people who are sharing those images as part of that coercive and controlling behaviour. Local authorities in England are now required to provide support to victims of domestic abuse. So that's now set in stone. And also in terms of housing, eligible homeless victims of domestic abuse will get priority need. So a lot of additional protections within there. Some simple things that really have been problematic in the past. GPs and other health professionals can no longer charge victims of domestic abuse for a letter to support their application for legal aid. And there are now new protection orders which are police issued and hopefully will prevent perpetrators from contacting their victims. I think, if you go to IDA's website, we've got fact sheets and all of this stuff, and particularly how does an employer take that information on, and how do they make that something that's practical and that can help their employees? And I guess simplistically, it's about making sure your HR function, if you have one, understands the new protections and can signpost that information for the individuals. But I think in general, it's a hugely important moment for everybody involved in the sector in terms of awareness and the public importance of the actual issue.
Excellent. So, Kate, that nicely leads on to you and sort of your direct experience in the workplace of how an employer can have in place policies. And we all know it's to some extent it's easy to have the policy, but it's actually then putting it into place, making sure everyone's aware of it and living that policy. So can you talk us through your experience from Liberty of that, please?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. Policy is a great starting point because it shows a clear commitment by a company to address a topic. But as we all know, actions speak louder than words. And the other thing that I found that in a big, complex organization like Liberty is that policies can also get buried because we've got so many of them. But the important thing is, like Steve also said, making sure that the processes are there, that the infrastructure is there, so that if someone does raise an issue, then action can be taken swiftly and efficiently to help that person. So, I mean, and also I think it's, and Steve, you also touched on this, it's really important to promote and publicize policies and processes in order to make them effective. So the example that I thought of was, say, for example, a company has a policy in place whereby company employees who are at a work event, after a certain time of night, they can get a cab and expense that to the company in order that they can get home safely. That in itself is a really great and commendable policy, but it has to be, employees need to be reminded frequently. So it's about sort of talking about these things openly. And this is an example of the difference between being a passive ally, i.e. merely publishing a policy, and an active ally, which is talking about it and making sure that it is utilised. And I think when talking about how companies can support their employees, it's really important to draw on a company's culture. for me, culture is absolutely everything, and even surpasses policies. As we've seen from Fiona Bowman's video, often people who have suffered from domestic violence or are at risk of doing so, the suffering is exacerbated by silence. And it's incumbent on companies to foster a culture of inclusivity and openness. And it's often the smallest gestures which make the biggest difference. So, listening, believing, and also senior leadership openly addressing difficult and sensitive topics that can make such difference. And I've got a recent example. One of Liberty's values is being open, and I can give a concrete example of how this was demonstrated after the murder of Sarah Everard. So our president and managing director communicates with all employees via his weekly blog, and he addressed the event in his blog and included a link to something that I had written on violence against women. And I know from the feedback that this was so appreciated in making people feel seen and heard and acknowledged at what was a really difficult time. I know that the Sarah Everard's murder had a huge impact on people living in London, and as will, Sabina Nessa. And it's just about companies opening up that psychological safe space, which is so critical in ensuring that the dial is moved on this topic.
Yes, it's very challenging, isn't it? In many ways, you sort of think the point that you've made about the availability of, a taxi home service. And I know in the past, if I've been out with colleagues, I've made sure that, I put them in a taxi, or that there will be someone to meet them at when they've got their train. But I mean, Harriet, you've got direct experience from the work that you did with your clients relating to John Warboys, that, you can think that you're doing the right thing, and then that in itself can create another problem. I don't know if you have anything to add from that sort of perspective, Harriet. Maybe you can explain to people who don't know who John Warboys was.
A long story, but John Warboys was a black cab driver in London, and I think the significance of this, he basically over a 6-year period, but probably longer, carried out a reign of terror on young women coming back, usually from nightclubs in central London. And what he would do was do the happy, clappy, chatty taxi driver and persuade women to take a drink. And women are so polite and hate offending that they just took a sip of this drink, which he had drugged, and he then sexually assaulted or raped the women before dropping them back semi-conscious or unconscious at their home addresses. And he continued to do this over a long period of time. And one of the issues we were dealing with there was about the police failures to apprehend him for such a long time. But one of the issues, I think, was this sort of, it was at the time, in fact, I think the Mayor of London was running a big campaign saying, don't trust unlicensed taxis, get in a black cab. And I know that the two clients I work with, one of the really painful things was this advertising campaign was going on, and they were saying, but this is what happened. I was raped in the back of a black cab, and no one believes me, and the police don't believe me. They just think I got drunk, and I don't remember what happened because they were drugged. So yes, it's one can't just sort of rely on the outside edifice. One has to understand that violence, intimate violence, is committed in all sorts of contexts by all sorts of men towards women, men towards men, sometimes women towards men, and it is something that you can't tell who is going to be the abuser. And I think a point I wanted to just raise of relevance to your membership. we talked a lot about domestic abuse, and it's very important, the work that all of you, our other speakers have talked about in terms of, creating a culture to encourage and enable women to disclose and to get support. And, the story we heard from Fiona, which was so powerful, and also, Jess's, Jess Phillips' account. But I mean, of course, one of the other huge issues in the employment context is sexual harassment. And, it is not just abuse that takes place outside of the workplace. That you need to be very alive to the risk of abuse within the workplace as well. And that is, equally, kind of a hugely important role for employers to take to tackle sexual violence and abuse. I have less experience around the sort of general employment field, but the one area we have done a lot of work around is abuse by police officers. We know, for example, Wayne Couzens, the murder of Sarah Everard, was in fact a police officer. So unfortunately, we can't necessarily, in the same way we can't necessarily trust a black cab driver, we can't necessarily trust a police officer. And we have put together what's known as a police super complaint to highlight the issue of what happens for women, who are in relationships with police officers, and whether or not they themselves are in the police. And I think Kate's point about the culture of the organisation, really rang true when I thought about the work we've done in relation to police abuse, because, you still have this kind of very macho locker room culture within the police. And so whilst there is some very good policing at tackling domestic abuse and sexual violence, we also have this sort of particular kind of culture that's very, very, very strong within policing amongst some, kind of groups of male officers, which you might describe as a sort of locker room culture. So certainly challenging cultural, the behaviour of employees and the leadership, of course, to create a kind of zero tolerance of male violence, of zero tolerance of sexual harassment, and to sort of have those conversations about issues like, we know pornography is now so widely available, and the kind of messages that come through pornography about, the kind of false narratives about the sorts of sex that should be permissible in a relationship and so on, just to really kind of tackle those issues, because there is a sort of underlying narrative, and until we really, really tackle that as well as all the other processes, we will see this pandemic of violence against women continue.
Yes, and you're absolutely right about the sort of the sexual harassment in the workplace, and even we've seen it through the everyone's invited and the harassment in schools, and I know when I came to BLM, one of the things that I introduced here was that we had a safeguarding policy, and I think some people thought that I was slightly mad because we didn't. The perception was, well, is there really any risk? And quite frankly, there's a risk in any organisation around safeguarding. So, Steve, from the perspective of obviously diving, we've been talking about what we can all do as allies, and I'm conscious that we haven't gotten as long as we would like today to talk about all of these things. But I'd like to come back to you now with some of your recommendations for what we can all do ourselves on a daily basis, in particular where we might think that someone is suffering from abuse and they've not said anything to us, or how to respond when someone discloses their experiences.
Yeah. Okay, I mean, I think, Paul, the theme is allyship, and I think from an employer point of view, I think the most important thing that the employer can do, and Kate touched on it, is create that culture, create an environment in which people will feel comfortable to disclose. I mean, when I say comfortable, I don't think anybody's ever comfortable, but create an environment where they can disclose. I think I would say to all employers, join IDA. It's free. But what's on that website is a toolkit which will give you all of the details that you need to get those conversations started. There's a myriad of different circumstances, so I mean, it'd be difficult for me to give you a specific example of what should and shouldn't be said, but there are huge amounts of assistance. We've got a handbook around that, which is freely available to everybody. I think it's about getting the CEO engaged in the business, if there is one. It's about business leaders being very vocal about it. Kate talked about that experience at Liberty, and when those individuals in the executive of a business, or the managers, or the owners, actually make a statement about it, it creates that environment where people will start to feel they maybe could ask for help. We've found almost with every employer that we do deal with, when they do take that first step and they create an awareness campaign, or they make it clear that they're engaged, there is disclosure more often than not. And to the point that was made by Fiona, this is a significant opportunity to change individuals' lives who are in a really difficult place and you wouldn't know it. I think get as many of your individual staff trained up on what looks like, what signs might be there that people are in a difficult situation. Changes in behaviour are very indicative of it. Performance issues. People are off work and there's a sort of predisposition to think, well, they're always ill. That's an issue for them. The reality is there may be a whole myriad of reasons behind that as to why they're not coming to work. And then the opposite of that are people who are in the work all the time, people who are staying late, people who are, I guess, for a lot of employers, look like the ideal employee. They're always there. They stay late, they come in early. It's very important that the people who are responsible for well-being in a business are able to have a conversation just to check in with those individuals and just make sure that this isn't something about them not wanting to go home, that it is something about them wanting to be in the workplace, because they're not the same thing. And I think in the current pandemic, I think all employers need to think very carefully about the environment in which some of their employees are working from home in. If we think that at times, Fiona talked about work being a sanctuary, well, imagine that sanctuary is taken away from you and you are then propelled into a situation where you're staying in an environment where you absolutely want to be away from all the time. We've got examples of some of our employer members creating circumstances where they are concerned about somebody, so they may ask to maybe that person to come into the office, to bring their passport in because they're doing an HR check. And that's an opportunity to have a conversation and check in with those individuals in a safe space where they are able to maybe ask difficult questions. I think in summary, it's get yourself educated, become engaged with the subject matter, create a culture where people feel they are able to talk to somebody. They won't always disclose to the business, but if you signpost them to all the resources that are available in the sector, they will reach out. There are apps available, loads of information on our website. I would encourage anybody listening in or watching to go and have a look and get yourself familiar with what's out there.
And it is, I vouch for that, it's a fantastic website, and the range of information that is available there is really, really helpful. And in our last few minutes, Kate, I mean, as if anybody needs any further excuse as to why this is really important and should be done by all, can you just very briefly comment on what the regulators are doing in this regard?
Yeah, of course. So as mentioned at the beginning, I work in compliance, so regulatory interactions are my bread and butter. And in July, the Bank of England, the PRA and the FCA published a joint discussion paper, Diversity and Inclusion in the Financial Sector, Working Together to Drive Change. And the discussion paper titled Working Together is really important because the discussion paper was a real call to arms for companies to help shape the regulatory landscape on this topic. And the regulators have emphasized that the time is now for regulators and the regulated to work together. And you might wonder, why are the regulators getting involved now and in this particular way? But just briefly, the PRA is concerned with preserving the soundness and stability of the financial sector and sees diversity and inclusion as a fundamental aspect of this. And the FCA has always been a principles-based regulator concerned with how firms conduct themselves within the environment in which they operate. as well as how they act in the best interests of their consumers. And that includes being representative of the diverse nature of their customers. And while the regulators haven't called out gender-based domestic violence in the discussion paper, the definitions they provide for diversity and inclusion are very wide to reflect the spirit of the topic. And the discussion paper does also touch on culture and the importance of creating a culture of psychological safety for employees to be able to speak up. And I think what's most important to remember is that we're really just at the beginning of this work. The regulators and the regulated are at the beginning of this journey, and there is going to be so much more to come on this.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we could talk about this for quite some time now, but unfortunately we have to draw things to a conclusion. I hope anyone out there who has been watching and listening, who themselves has been subject to violence, or members of their family have been, that this has provided some support and has not been a triggering or traumatic event, and hopefully you have employers out there who you will be able to turn to, and that we will all take away from today that this is something that is relevant to all of us, no matter who we are, where we are, what our position is, and that there is more that we can all be doing to support each other, to deal with what has been described as a pandemic and a public health emergency. So it leaves me just to thank Harriet, Steve and Kate for their very insightful contributions, to thank Jess, although she's not here, for her contribution, and most importantly to thank Fiona for her very powerful film. Thank you all.